Scout of the Endless Frontier, Episode 6. Blind in the Dark. By Elton Gar. By the end of 2 weeks, Elias wondered if Rust would ever tire of playing. And there was some small part of him who wondered if the dog wouldn't be better here. But it was the dog who began to spend his time on the ghost wake, sleeping on his bed in the ship instead of in the grass or next to the girl, who didn't seem to need him as much now that her parents were awake. The biggest reason he hadn't left already wasn't Rust, though. It was because he wanted to make sure that the people he had met would do well. They had been asleep for almost 100 years, and so there was almost no farmland, little food stored up, and millions of people all over the world to be woken. But even without being able to speak their language, it became clear they understood the problem as well as he did, because, besides not waking up people all at once, they seemed almost entirely focused on storing up food in preparation for waking up more people. So, he traded them a few spheres of food and then whistled for Rust and got on the ghost wake. Once there, he connected to the satellites that he had put in orbit a few weeks ago and downloaded the data they had been collecting. He expected limited signals. There was radio from the world below, but beyond seeing that increasing quickly, he didn't get much out of it since he didn't know their language. But once he looked past that, he saw something else. It was a pulsing signal. That alone wasn't that surprising. There was intelligent life all over the galaxy, and a lot of them broadcast messages, or just set up navigation beacons. There were two things that made this one odd. The first was that it wasn't that far away, and the other was that it wasn't near a star. That was enough to convince him it was worth exploring. While the ship prepared for FTL travel, he double-checked the last living organisms from Calthera 6. The small plant had been getting stronger over the last month. He wasn't sure how much of that was the plant simply adapting to being on the ship and recovering, and how much it was the highly advanced virus that was being hid in the plant. Either way, he was glad to see it was doing well, just like he was glad that Rust was so much happier than he had been. It almost felt wrong for everything to be going so well, while he was also out here trying to hide from one of the most powerful corporations in the Commonwealth. But he didn't expect that he'd have to worry about that for long. Things always went wrong eventually. The pulse turned out to be coming from one of the largest space stations he had ever seen. That wasn't entirely surprising. Almost every spacefaring species eventually began to build space habitats. Even the massive ones were easier than terraforming, and they allowed you to expand a civilization without having to expand its borders. But he had never heard of one being built in the empties of space. It made far more sense to build it near a star. That allowed for solar power and a lot more opportunities for mining. But more than that, there was no advantage to building it this far away from everything else. The station was well maintained, but looked ancient, and there were minimal signs that it was being used for anything. The pulse suggested some amount of power, and there were a few odd ships attached to it. But it wasn't the center of trade and industry that a station this size would be in the Commonwealth. As he approached, that got even stranger. It was always hard to tell how big something was in space. But the closer he got, the more insane the scale seemed to be. The station was at least 1,000 kilometers on one side. He picked one of the docking stations that had a ship on it. Each of them had room for hundreds of ships, which suggested even more that there was something wrong. As the Ghostwake reached the dock, the station reached out and locked onto it. The control of the ship was locked out. That wasn't unusual for a manned station. It made it less likely someone would accidentally smash into the station. But usually when a station was abandoned, you'd turn that off, because there was no good way for Elias to undock, except to go into the station and do it himself. Well, he had said he expected things to go wrong. And if the worst thing to happen was that he had to walk through an abandoned station for a few days until he figured out how to undock his ship, he'd be happy. The station lights flickered, so that the world bounced between black, with only a few red and green lights that didn't give off enough to see anything, to the bright sterile light of fluorescent lights. But beyond the flickering lights, the station simply seemed abandoned. So Elias brought Rust with him. The dog didn't like the flickering lights any more than Elias, but it would be safer with him. The immediate area looked to have once been a commercial docking area, and as Elias began to walk slowly through it, he realized that if it was actually abandoned, this might be the greatest find of his career. A station this size, with at least some functionality, and no one claiming it could become a hub for the exploration of this entire section of the galaxy. A remote headquarters for a corporation. Of course, he'd have to contact them for that, but with the amount of money this could give him, that might be safe. Heck, he could probably get a management position in a corporation in return for the information about this place. As he considered that, he heard something. A clanging noise that was, he hoped, the sound of some piece of machinery turning on or off. Rust turned to face it, dropping into a more ready position, and Elias put one hand on the talon and the other on the Genic oath blade. He didn't think it was likely he'd need either, but as he moved towards the noise, he couldn't be certain. What he found was an air vent, but several of the screws had fallen out so that it pushed out when the fans came on, and fell back into place with a large banging sound when it turned off. So, at least some amount of life support was still working. That made the abandonment of this station even more odd. Why would you build something this large and then leave while it was still working? The screws were just below the vent, so he put them back in. They fit perfectly and tight, making Elias wonder how it was they had come loose and putting him more on edge. As he considered that, the entire room went dark again as the light flickered, and he saw that one of the green lights was just above him. Close enough that anyone in the room who could see that green light would see him almost as easily in the dark as they would in the light. Perhaps he was being paranoid, he thought, but he jumped out of the way. As he did, he heard something hit the vent. He crawled a few feet in the darkness as the light came on. There was no one in sight, but there was a spiked ball of metal embedded in the metal of the vent. It wasn't large, but there were curved blades on it, and it was where his stomach would have been. That was an odd choice of weapon. It wouldn't have killed him. It probably wouldn't have even injured him that badly, but it certainly would have slowed him down. It was, of course, possible that he had just triggered some trap. Perhaps the people who had left this place had wanted to discourage looters, but also didn't want to kill them. He moved quickly as he thought, at first turning to return to the Ghost Wake. But that was pointless. He could stay on the ship if he needed, but unless he was willing to try to break the docking rings with his engine, he couldn't leave the station. Not a terrible trap, he thought. But there was another option, one that might tell him something. He had docked here because it was one of the few places with another ship. It was only 3 spots down from the Ghost Wake, and so he moved towards that. Remembering all of his military training, he ducked down. His leg ached as he moved, but he ignored it. Pain wasn't important right now, speed was. Then, after about 15 steps, he stopped quickly. The dog kept going, moving faster than Elias, but he also heard something else. There was someone else moving. Someone who didn't want Elias to know they were there because they stopped as soon as they knew Elias had. He still couldn't see them even as the bright lights began to flicker again, moving towards another moment of black. So he moved towards the edge of the station, but not directly towards the ship. It might not work, but he had an idea. As soon as the lights went out, he changed direction and ran, moving towards the other ship. He heard something metal hit the wall. Another of their weapons, he suspected, but he wasn't where he would have been, so it missed. A bit of luck. He grabbed the handle of the airlock to the other ship, just as the lights flickered back on. He doubted it would buy him much time, but he slipped inside, then moved down the 15-foot airlock and put his back towards the wall. Whoever was attacking him seemed too smart to walk into such an obvious death trap, but he couldn't afford to ignore the possibility that they would just rush in. He also couldn't ignore the possibility that there were other people on the ship. It was even possible that the person who had attacked Elias thought he was protecting them. That would explain the use of a weapon that didn't kill him immediately. Rust stood next to him, alert as well. That helped Elias relax a little because if someone came out of the ship, they would be unlikely to get the drop on both of them. He waited far longer than made any reasonable sense in that position. This was a stalemate in the short term, but in the long run, Elias was trapped here while his hunter wasn't. So he slowly opened the door to the ship, and even though he didn't like doing it, let Rust go in first. If Rust was injured, then Elias could try to help him, but the other was not true. The ship wasn't much bigger than the Ghost Wake. That was good to know, because it suggested that he probably wasn't all that outnumbered. But that was where the good news ended, because everything in the ship suggested that this wasn't simply someone defending themselves. The first thing he saw was a wall of weapons, each in a precise place and immaculately clean. There were modern weapons like laser and plasma weapons alongside more primitive weapons that used gunpowder or other propellants. And next to them were dozens of different styles of melee weapons. Alien versions of swords, axes, spears, and weapons were different enough that he wasn't sure they would be classified as any of them. There were also a few open spots, likely the weapons that his opponent had on him. And he was fairly certain that it was an opponent. And the worst type, someone who enjoyed killing. What told him that was the other wall? That was where he kept his trophies. There were skulls of a few animals, though they could have been sentient species. There were also a few pieces of jewelry, some insignia and other things that many races used for decoration, and so became important symbols for the people who used them. Finally, there was a spot for armor near the door, though no armor. That could be a problem, but what the Talon lost in speed, it made up for in power. Its plasma beam would go through several inches of armor, if you hit it. The rest of the room was utilitarian. All the things you might need, but unlike the other things, they didn't seem to care about them for anything but utility. He considered the weapons, but outside of some of the blades, there were just too many questions. You couldn't rely on a weapon you didn't know, and reliability was more important than almost anything in combat. The other option was to try to leave. Breaking free of the docking ring was a danger to the ship, but this wasn't his ship. He'd be safe at least for a little while. But there would be no good way to get back to his own ship, so he'd be trapped on an alien ship with nowhere to go. He carefully entered the airlock, fully aware that if the person had figured out he had entered the ship, that it would make just as good an ambush point coming out as going in. But there was no one there. Once on the other side, he waited until the light began to flicker, and then sprinted out. Rust rushed with him, turning so that they weren't so close together that his enemy could easily attack them both. Every time the light flickered out, Elias changed his direction, and every time there was a shot. He had assumed that the green light had mattered, but he was beginning to suspect the alien could see in the dark. That gave him an idea. So as he ran, he turned the wideness of the beam on the Talon all the way to max and the intensity all the way down. It was a pointless setting, unless he was right. He reached one of the hallways while the cycle of flickering lights was at its brightest. The alien had yet to shoot at him when the light was on, and he suspected he understood why. So he stopped. A few seconds later, the pulsing pattern of energy in the station started its cycle again, and the lights flickered off, then on. At first, it was too fast to really matter. More like blinking than the lights going off. But after about 10 flickers, the light stayed dark a bit longer. Then even longer. And finally, there was almost 10 seconds of darkness. That was when he had been shot at every time, and he would be again, he was almost certain. He just hoped his timing was right as he counted in his head 3, 4, 5, fire. The settings on the plasma pistol made it almost useless as a weapon. It was instead a blindingly bright flashlight. Almost blinding to Elias, and he hoped far more blinding to the nocturnal hunter who was following him. It also made it clear why he hadn't seen him, as he saw not his hunter, but the outline of him. It wasn't uncommon for species to have natural camouflage, but this was far more impressive. Perhaps it was augmented by technology. Either way, there was no time to care. He drew out the genic blade as he rushed the alien. He made it halfway to where the outline had been when he felt a stinging pain hit him in the leg. It began to go numb, but he had enough strength to make it the last 10 steps and smash into what was effectively empty space before his leg gave out entirely. He didn't know how effective the poison was. He suspected this creature liked the hunt too much for it to be lethal. Once on the ground, the numb leg didn't matter much, and having spent years with a bad leg, Elias was more used to it than the hunter might expect. And his weapon was already drawn, so he cut the creature. The creature faded in as it struggled. It was humanoid, but with huge black eyes and leathery green skin. And it had a number of weapons, including the almost ritualistic-looking gun that it had shot him with. It seemed, from what he could see, to have a single shot and then had to be reloaded. But it also had a dagger that it was reaching for. Elias grabbed the creature's arm with his left hand, trying to keep it from that weapon while slashing out with his right. The creature was stronger than him, but not enough to simply ignore him. So once its hand was on it, Elias simply pushed down, making it impossible for it to pull up. This wasn't his first knife fight, and yet Elias was always impressed by how much you had to injure someone to get them to stop fighting. He had seen people slashed or stabbed dozens of times and keep fighting. After the third slash, the creature roared, its odd trilateral mouth opening to show hundreds of teeth. Then it pushed a button on its belt, and Elias was pushed backwards by an energy field. He almost dropped the dagger as he went back, but he couldn't even move his hand enough to do that. Then the creature almost gently put him down. Once he was on the ground, it made a gesture of putting both of its hands together for a second, then releasing them. It then took a piece of jewelry attached to his armor, hung it over Elias's neck, and turned and walked away. If he had been able to shoot, Elias may have shot the creature in the back. But it was almost 30 seconds before he could move again. Readjusting the talon, he followed the creature and reached the main room just in time to see it enter its ship. Likely going to heal, he thought. But he was also fairly certain that this was over. But he hadn't solved the mystery of this place. The hunter hadn't built it. It just didn't seem the type of species to build massive stations in the middle of nowhere. But for now, he sat on the ground and pulled the small hook out of his leg. There was no pain. Not the best sign, but as he took out his backup first aid kit, rust began to lick the wound. He couldn't feel it much, but the numbness seemed to be already retreating. So, in a few minutes, he'd probably be able to walk out of here. Then, after a few days of healing, he could go back to exploring this station.
Author's note: every month, I let my readers pick the theme of my stories. This month the theme is, I've seen this one before. The idea is fairly simple. I take well-known stories and write a new story that is similar, but of course also different. For this story, I wanted a good action story, and so I had a couple of good ideas. But of them, Predator is the one that worked best for a one-on-one conflict. And there is a reason that Predator works so well as a movie. It's a great setup for action. Of course, there is some story left on the station, and I will get to that next week. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you. Elton Gar.